Lesson 52, Getting Out of Vietnam. Getting Out of Vietnam. What lessons for Americans emerged from the Vietnam War? In 1968, Richard Nixon promised to end the war in Vietnam. U.S. combat troops withdrew in 1973, and the South Vietnamese army began to lose ground to North Vietnam. By mid-April 1975, most of South Vietnam had fallen to the communists who were now threatening Saigon. 7 years after the initial promise, on April 29, 1975, Nixon ordered all American personnel to immediately vacate South Vietnam. That day, Saigon erupted in chaos as the streets filled with South Vietnamese trying to flee the invading communist army. Some sailed small boats to sea, hoping to board U.S. ships. Others flocked to the U.S. Embassy to secure passage on the helicopters ferrying American personnel to safety. Several thousand Vietnamese were evacuated that day, but most were turned away for a lack of space. The experience was often traumatic, even for those who managed to get out. One evacuee described the fate of her family. When we got the signal that we could leave, my family divided into two. My four brothers went with my uncle's family. My three sisters and I went with my parents. We left by boat. My mother, my brothers, my uncle went by helicopter. We've never found them. My parents tried to find them through the American Red Cross. They looked everywhere, but we have never found them. My parents lost four sons. It was a very painful experience. We still aren't over it, and probably never will be. President Nixon had hoped to negotiate a peaceful end to the Vietnam War that would leave South Vietnam free and independent. Why did the United States fail to achieve that goal? This lesson examines the final years of the war and the perspectives on the significance of this conflict. Many South Vietnamese attempted to flee Saigon during the American evacuation on April 29, 1975. Here, evacuees boarded a helicopter perched on a Saigon rooftop. Numerous others were unable to escape, including several hundred people who waited at the U.S. Embassy for helicopters that never arrived. Nixon's Dilemma: Achieving Peace with Honor. President Nixon entered the White House with a mandate to alter the course of the Vietnam War. To accomplish this, Nixon relied heavily on his national security advisor, Henry Kissinger. Both men drew two fundamental conclusions regarding the war. First, Nixon and Kissinger agreed that the war was not winnable in a conventional sense. U.S. forces could not fight their war in Hanoi like the Allies had invaded Berlin in World War II, due to the significant political cost and sacrifice of American lives. Second, Nixon and Kissinger decided that the United States could not abruptly withdraw from Vietnam in a cut and run, as this strategy would damage U.S. credibility and as a supportive ally. Instead, Nixon sought to achieve peace with honor and end the war while maintaining the reputation of the United States. Nixon chose a carrot-and-stick approach, a tactic that combines actions that reward the carrot with the actions that punish the stick. Using this strategy, he hoped to persuade North Vietnamese to accept a negotiated end to the war. The carrot: peace talks and Vietnamization. Little progress was made after the peace talks commenced in Paris in May of 1968. In 1969, Nixon sent Kissinger to Paris to reopen negotiations with the North Vietnamese diplomats. Kissinger proposed ending the bombing of the North, the carrot, in exchange for their agreement to withdraw troops from South Vietnam. Kissinger insisted that South Vietnam be independent. The North Vietnamese rejected this offer as a farce, claiming that they were prepared to remain in Paris until the chairs rot. When diplomacy failed to induce peace with honor, Nixon decided to attempt another approach, known as Vietnamization. Per this strategy, South Vietnam would gradually take over the conduct of the war, while American GIs would steadily be withdrawn. Nixon therefore offered North Vietnam the carrot of reducing U.S. troops and simultaneously ease the anti-war tensions at home. Vietnamization was part of a broader U.S. policy that called for each American ally in Asia to accept primary responsibility for providing soldiers for its own defense. The number of U.S. troops in Vietnam peaked in March of 1969 at 543,000, more than 60,000 of whom would be withdrawn by the end of the year. Vietnamization set three main goals for South Vietnam: self-government, self-development, and self-defense. According to this plan, political reform, including local elections, would increase popular participation in government and provide for essential public services. Rural development would create economic opportunity in the countryside, while pacification would establish local self-defense forces to control village security. U.S. officials believed that by strengthening South Vietnam's military forces was key to Vietnamization. Training schools were expanded, soldiers' pay in South Vietnam's Army ARVN was increased, and military camp living conditions were improved. So many U.S. ships, planes, helicopters, and vehicles were shipped to Vietnam that one congressman wondered whether the goal of Vietnamization was to put every South Vietnamese soldier behind the wheel. The stick, widening the air war and invading Cambodia. Vietnamization would be a long, arduous process, and many American officials were pessimistic about its prospects. Meanwhile, the negotiations in Paris were proving fruitless. The United States' carrot offer of withdrawing troops and ending bombing did not satisfy the North Vietnamese. Nixon considered several military tactics to pressure North Vietnam to negotiate, including bombing its industrial areas, mining its harbors, and invading its territory. His strategy, which he named Madman Theory, was to convince North Vietnam's leaders and their allies, the Soviet Union and China, that he would do anything to win the war. Nixon briefly put nuclear forces on alert, bluffing that he might deploy tactical nuclear weapons, small but highly destructive nuclear bombs. Nixon had previously demonstrated his willingness to expand the war. In March of 1969, he secretly ordered B-52 bombers to begin bombing Cambodia, a neutral nation on the Vietnam's western border. For the next 4 years, U.S. bombers would strike communist base camps, and supply lines in Cambodia. Under Vietnamization, U.S. ground forces focused their efforts on intercepting supplies from the north rather than fighting guerrillas in the south. Nixon decided to give these ground forces an additional mission. In April of 1970, he ordered U.S. troops to invade Cambodia. The invading U.S. forces' military goal was to destroy enemy, quote, safe havens, end quote, from which North Vietnamese Army, NVA, and Viet Cong forces could launch assaults into South Vietnam. The political goal, said Nixon, was to show the enemy that they were still serious about commitment in Vietnam. The invasion was a partial success, as GIs destroyed enemy bases and relieved pressure on ARVN forces fighting in the south. The invasion hurt the peace process, however. The communists boycotted the Paris talks until U.S. troops left Cambodia 3 months later. In February of 1971, Nixon launched a similar invasion of Laos, another neighboring country to Vietnam, after years of bombing failed to dislodge the communists there. The steady withdrawal of GIs had left fewer than 175,000 U.S. combat soldiers in Vietnam, so ARVN troops conducted the ground fighting in Laos, while the U.S. contributed air support. However, a large, well-equipped NVA force easily defeated the ARVN, forcing them to retreat. So far, Vietnamization had failed to prove its worth on the battlefield. Section 2. Expanded war sparks increased protest. Vietnamization dampened anti-war protests until November 12, 1969, when journalist Seymour Hersh published an article describing a grisly killing spree at My Lai, a village in South Vietnam. The My Lai massacre occurred in March of 1968 and was then covered up by the U.S. military. Believing My Lai to be a Viet Cong stronghold, the U.S. soldiers traveled to the village on a search and destroy mission. They found no armed Viet Cong in the village, only women and children and old men. Still, one morning the soldiers rounded up and executed about 500 of these civilians. Only a handful of villagers survived. News of the massacre shocked Americans, although many doubted such an atrocity could occur. Others believed that the soldiers were merely following orders and that their actions were justified. Regardless, enough Americans expressed outrage over the massacre that President Nixon decided to accelerate the withdrawal of troops from Vietnam. Demonstrations increase on city streets and college campuses. The news of the My Lai added fuel to the rekindled anti-war movement. About a month before, on October 15, 1969, peace activists staged the biggest anti-war demonstration in U.S. history, known as the Nationwide Vietnam Moratorium Day. A moratorium is a suspension of activity. Organizers asked Americans to take the day off and reflect on the war. More than 2 million people, from young students to older middle-class Americans, participated in this day of dramatic and widespread protest. They joined rallies and marches, attended church services, and engaged in discussions. About 250,000 demonstrators flocked to the nation's capital, where tens of thousands marched from Washington Monument to the White House, where protesters held a candlelight vigil. Nixon responded to this outpouring of anti-war sentiment with a televised speech on November 3rd, reminding viewers of Vietnamization and his plan for withdrawing U.S. troops. He ended with an appeal for support for the great silent majority of my fellow Americans, and he warned, the more divided we are at home, the less likely the enemy is to negotiate at Paris. Nixon's speech successfully quieted the anti-war movement for a time. The invasion of Cambodia in 1970, however, catalyzed another upsurge in the protest. Students held mass rallies and demonstrations, some of which became violent. One of these incidents, the Kent State shootings, occurred when students at Kent State University in Ohio held a peace rally on May 4th after several days of violent unrest, which included the burning of the Army Reserve's Officers Training Corps, ROTC building on campus. National Guard troops called out to quell the protest, ordered the crowd to disperse. In response to the National Guard's actions, some students chanted slogans and threw rocks. The troops then opened fire, killing 4 students and wounding 9. 10 days later, a similar incident took place at Jackson State College in Mississippi. Protesters threw debris at police, and officers responded with shotguns and machine gun fire that left 2 students dead. Reactions to these incidents varied. Many Americans were stunned as protests erupted at college campuses and in cities across the nation. Vietnam veterans participated in some of these protests, as did several labor unions. Only a small percentage of Americans ever demonstrated publicly, however, as many deemed anti-war protests unpatriotic and disruptive. In May of 1970, construction workers in New York City demonstrated their disgust with anti-war protesters by marching in support of the war. Some soldiers wrote home asking for public support, like one Army nurse who told her parents, "Display the flag, Mom and Dad, and tell your friends to do the same. It means so much to us to know we're supported, to know not everyone feels we're making a mistake being there." The Pentagon Papers raised new questions about the war. In 1971, a former Department of Defense official, Daniel Ellsberg, leaked a top-secret study known as the Pentagon Papers to the New York Times. This study revealed how previous administrations had deceived Congress and the public about Vietnam. Nixon feared the document's release might lead to further investigation of his own policies and secret actions in Vietnam. The government lawyers secured a temporary restraining order to halt publication of the Pentagon Papers, and their appeal for a permanent injunction went to the Supreme Court in the case New York Times Company versus United States. On June 30th, 1971, the court ruled 6-3 against the government and in favor of free speech. In the court's opinion, the government had not adequately proved the need for prior restraint or the prevention of speech or expression before the publication. Congress responds to widening war. After Nixon's invasion of Cambodia, anti-war Congress members intensified their efforts. By the end of 1970, they had repealed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which had allowed Johnson and Nixon to escalate the conflict in Southeast Asia without a formal declaration of war. In February of 1971, Congress passed legislation forbidding U.S. troops from operating outside the borders of South Vietnam. 2 years later, when Congress learned that Nixon had secretly bombed Cambodia without congressional approval, lawmakers passed the War Powers Resolution. This law placed strict limits on a president's power to engage in the U.S. armed forces in hostilities without the authorization of Congress. By this time, congressional support for the war had declined significantly. U.S. troops slaughtered hundreds of Vietnamese citizens at the My Lai massacre. 20 or so officers were later charged with crimes, but only the unit leader, Lieutenant William Calley, was found guilty. He was issued a life sentence but gained parole after serving 3.5 years. Escalation of the Vietnam War prompted renewed protests across the nation. These demonstrators in Des Moines, Iowa, called for U.S. withdrawal of Vietnam. Their posters connected anti-war protests to the civil rights movement. Throughout the Vietnam War, Americans protested both for and against the conflict. Although pro-war supporters were not as vocal as anti-war protesters, pro-war demonstrators were still organized, including the one pictured above. In 1967, in addition, New York City construction workers held marches to support the war in May of 1970. American involvement in the war ends. By Nixon's inauguration in 1969, some 30,000 Americans had already died in Vietnam. During Nixon's first year as president, 11,500 more U.S. soldiers died and another 55,000 were wounded. By sending more soldiers home, Vietnamization drastically lowered U.S. casualties over the next 3 years. ARVN soldiers would be granted the chance to prove that they could withstand an NVA assault without the assistance of U.S. troops in the spring of 1972. North Vietnamese troops, aided by tanks and artillery, invaded South Vietnam on March 30th, smashing through the ARVN defenders at the border. With only 6,000 soldiers left in the country, U.S. military provided air power to counter the invasion. In April, Nixon escalated U.S. troop responses by ordering U.S. bombers to strike North Vietnam for the first time since 1969. He also commanded the military to mine Haiphong and other North Vietnamese ports to explode arriving war supplies from China and the Soviet Union. By mid-June, Nixon achieved this goal of destroy the enemy's war-making capacity. When the North's offensive was shut down, the ARVN forces drove the invaders back. Nixon declares peace is at hand. After the country's failed invasion, North Vietnamese delegates were more cooperative at the secret Paris peace talks, withdrawing their demand for Viet Cong to share power in South Vietnam's government. In return, the United States ended bombing strikes and agreed for some NVA forces to remain in the South. With these compromises, Henry Kissinger reached an agreement with Hanoi's diplomats. Less than 2 weeks before the 1972 presidential election, Kissinger spoke at a news conference announcing, "We believe that peace is at hand." Polls indicated that Nixon possessed a large lead over Democratic candidate George McGovern, an anti-war senator. On election night, Nixon won his second term in a landslide. Despite Kissinger's claim, peace was not truly at hand, because South Vietnam's President Nguyen Van Thieu feared that the United States was abandoning his country to the communists. Nguyen insisted on dozens of changes to the Paris Agreement. Displeased, Hanoi's leaders backed out and the peace talks collapsed. Frustration by the failed talks, Nixon decided to punish the North. On December 14th, he ordered a series of B-52 and fighter bomber attacks on Hanoi and Haiphong, called the Christmas bombings. This aerial campaign reached an intensity not previously seen in the war. As one NVA leader claimed, it was like living through a typhoon, with trees crashing down and lightning transforming the night into day. With this campaign, Nixon aimed to destroy North Vietnam's will to fight and intended to demonstrate to President Thieu that the United States would vigorously enforce the terms of a settled peace treaty in the future. After Nixon's assault, North Vietnam returned to the bargaining table, and South Vietnam agreed to the previous terms of the settlement. By late January, the negotiators had finalized a treaty. On January 27, 1973, representatives from the United States, South Vietnam, North Vietnam, and the Viet Cong signed the Paris Peace Accords, which established the goal of ending the war and restoring peace in Vietnam. To this end, the treaty ordered a ceasefire and retained the dividing line between North and South Vietnam at the 17th parallel. It also called for withdrawals of all U.S. troops and release of every U.S. prisoner of war. Veterans and prisoners of war return home. The United States had withdrawn all combat forces from Vietnam by March 29, 1973. Upon arriving home, many U.S. soldiers were dismayed to find themselves the victims of the country's bitter debate over the war. Unlike returning soldiers from World War II, most Vietnam veterans were not considered heroes, and few communities welcomed their returning soldiers with parades or celebrations. Because Vietnam veterans were often shunned or ignored by the general public, these soldiers did not receive adequate support and understanding from their service and sacrifice. Particularly for combat veterans, the Vietnam War had been a harrowing experience. Many were haunted by their experience in battle and by the death and destruction they had witnessed. They often only spoke of their combat experience in the presence of other veterans. Of the 2.6 million Americans who served in Vietnam, nearly 500,000 suffered from the mental illness known as post-traumatic stress disorder, symptoms of which include anxiety, irritability, nightmares, and depression. More than 760 Americans were taken prisoner by the North Vietnamese over the course of the war. At least 110 of these prisoners of war, POWs, died in captivity. Typical POWs were pilots captured after their planes were shot down. POWs lived in miserable conditions, often in solitary confinement, and faced regular interrogation and torture. One former POW described his experience in a Hanoi prison. From the moment you enter a political prison, you are told and forced to act as though you are subhuman, a dreg of society, and there's every effort made to remind you daily that they're looking at you. You're not to look at the sky. That's enough to get you a left hook to the jaw. You're to bow down. You have no rights. You have no name. You have no nationality. You are a criminal. You are a worm. North Vietnam released all POWs by April 1st, 1973. Another 2,600 Americans were declared MIA, or missing in action. Some 1,800 MIAs remain lost, very few of whom are thought to be alive. These POWs are disembarking a bus at Gia Liam Airport, Hanoi, after being released from a North Vietnamese prison. Although some POWs were eventually able to leave prison, many died in captivity. Vietnam War POWs endured difficult conditions, suffering both physically and mentally. The war in Vietnam comes to an end. After the U.S. ground forces withdrew from Vietnam, President Thieu and the ARVN continued to depend on U.S. air power. American bombers and fighter jets played a critical role in the war, and South Vietnam relied on Nixon's promise to respond with full force if North Vietnam violated the ceasefire. "You can be sure," Nixon told Thieu in April of 1973, "that we stand with you as we continue to work together to build a lasting peace." South Vietnam falls to the communist North. The ceasefire did not last long. In 1973 and 1974, fighting erupted between insurgents and the ARVN, killing some 50,000 ARVN soldiers. Meanwhile, North Vietnam rebuilt its army and military apparatus in preparation for a renewed invasion of the South. The NVA launched an all-out offensive in March of 1975. As ARVN forces scattered in the face of this assault, Thieu implored the United States for help. President Gerald Ford, who had succeeded Nixon in 1974, urged Congress to boost military aid but did not demand that U.S. forces return to Vietnam. In a speech delivered on April 23, 1975, Ford said, "America can regain the sense of pride that existed before Vietnam, but it cannot be achieved by refighting a war that is finished as far as America is concerned." 4 days after Ford's speech, the NVA surrounded Saigon. As panic gripped the city, U.S. Embassy personnel worked frantically to evacuate more than 1,000 Americans and several thousand South Vietnamese. Helicopters airlifted most of these evacuees from the U.S. Embassy rooftop to American ships waiting offshore. Early on April 30th, NVA tanks and troops entered Saigon unopposed. President Thieu had resigned and fled 9 days earlier, and his replacement, Duong Van Minh, surrendered unconditionally, stating, "I declare that Saigon government from central to the local level has been completely dissolved. The Vietnam War, as well as South Vietnam itself, had come to an end." The aftermath of the war in Southeast Asia. The end of the war did not end the suffering in Vietnam, nor did it stop suffering in Cambodia and Laos, where separate communist revolts occurred. In each of these countries, local communist insurgents took over and began to convert civilians to communism. In Vietnam, communists seized private property and nationalized businesses. Instead of the bloodbath many anti-communists had feared, Vietnamese communists sent hundreds of thousands of people, including ARVN officers, government officials, scholars, and religious leaders, to re-education camps, where they were subject to hard labor. The communists also relocated a similar number of city residents to rural, quote, economic zones to toil on collective farms. Since 1975, more than 1 million South Vietnamese have fled the country. Because many refugees left Vietnam by boat, they were named the Boat People. The majority of these refugees eventually settled in the United States. A similar period of turmoil followed the communist takeover in Laos, producing some 350,000 refugees. Meanwhile, Cambodians suffered when their country's communist regime, the Khmer Rouge, cleared urban areas and forced some 3 million city residents to work hard labor on farms. Nearly 1.7 million Cambodians, officials, merchants, members of minority groups, and others were worked to death, starved, and killed, or were killed outright. The aftermath of the war in the United States. The United States was in a collective state of shock following the Vietnam War. Over 58,000 U.S. soldiers died in the war, and another 300,000 were wounded. Many sustained severe injuries. To some Americans, these soldiers' sacrifices seemed pointless because the United States lost a war that ultimately could have been avoided. For others, failure to win the war meant that the nation lacked the resolve to be a world leader. For several years after the war, Americans attempted to forget the painful memories of Vietnam, yet these memories sparked changes. For one, the country limited its involvement in global conflicts for a period of time. Also, because of the credibility gap fostered by the government officials during the conflict, Americans' blind trust in the words of their leaders diminished. A monument erected in 1982 helped many Americans, especially Vietnam veterans, come to terms with the war. The wall, part of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C., encouraged Americans to reflect on the conflict and heal some of the war wounds. After visiting the wall, many veterans finally felt that they had come home. After the communist victory in Vietnam, many South Vietnamese sought to escape communism by fleeing the country, 500,000 of whom left in boats. More than 50,000 of these boat people died at sea. The remainder found refuge in other countries or returned to Vietnam. In 1969, President Nixon began withdrawing U.S. troops from Vietnam, but the war continued throughout his time in office. He carried on peace talks with the North Vietnamese, but also ordered a massive bombing of North Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. He faced ongoing protests from the anti-war movement and criticism from Congress. In 1973, the last U.S. combat forces came home. North Vietnam swept to victory over the South in 1975. Vietnamization. Nixon's Vietnamization of the war withdrew U.S. troops while preparing South Vietnamese forces to assume responsibility for the war. My Lai Massacre. In 1968, U.S. soldiers slaughtered hundreds of Vietnamese civilians in the village of My Lai. Reports of the massacre shocked Americans and bolstered anti-war protests. Kent State shooting. The invasion of Cambodia in 1970 sparked an increase in anti-war protests. The most violent incident occurred during the following month at Kent State University in Ohio, where National Guard's troops fired into a crowd of protesters, killing 4 students. War Powers Resolution. Congress responded to Nixon's activities in Cambodia by passing the War Powers Resolution, which limits a president's ability to send armed forces into combat. Pentagon Papers. In 1971, Daniel Ellsberg leaked a top-secret study of the U.S. role in Indochina to the press. This study, called the Pentagon Papers, revealed secrecy and deceit on the part of the U.S. presidents. Both people, the North Vietnamese, defeated South Vietnam and took control in 1975. This prompted an exodus of refugees from Indochina, many of whom fled by boat.